Thank you so much, Professor Strawn, for that insightful speech with a historical focus as well. Now, finally, as our last speaker of the evening, we have...
Point of order. I apologize to all of you. After Rebecca's speech, I have to run a train.
Not to worry at all, and we'll make sure that... could we have a guest liaison go and sort of fetch Dr. Wilson's bag as well, please? So finally, as our final speaker of this evening, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Rebecca Johnson. Dr. Rebecca Johnson has been the head of the acronym Institute for Disarmament Diplomacy and had occupied Greenham Common in the 80s. She's a lifelong campaigner, activist, doing extensive academic research on the issue of nuclear weapons, and we are delighted to welcome you today.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to start by actually reiterating the motion that we're debating. This House believes nuclear weapons have made the world safer. Now, I think this side of the House, not only the speakers here, but also many of the contributors from the floor have added very important points that show that indeed nuclear weapons have not made the world safer, and also pose the questions, safer for whom? So I want to just expand a little bit on that before warming into some other arguments, because I think it's very important that we know. Safer, for example, we had a speaker here talking about the human aspect. Deterrence, they couldn't sell deterrence until they got into the weeds of numbers theory and tried to think out, to expel the human aspect. But it is the human aspect that is both the problem and, as we heard in the example of Colonel Petrov brought up, actually makes a difference when there's computer errors, satellite errors, interpretation errors, miscalculation, mistakes that can bring the world not just to the brink of a nuclear war, but to the use of nuclear weapons that in very febrile situations and very fast decision times that do not really take human thinking into account can lead to what's known euphemistically as exchanges of nuclear weapons, but it's actually nuclear war. A nuclear war that destroys and then doesn't know when to stop destroying, because that's part of the logic of deterrence with nuclear weapons when you've also got humans. Now, I, for a number of years, was the spokesperson for security, peace and defense for the Green Party, and in that capacity was invited to lecture 2 or 3 times a year at the Shrivenham Defence Academy, not only on the policies, but on nuclear treaties, because that's my area of expertise. That's what I did my PhD on, also LSE, I'm afraid. But one of the things I can tell you that Defence Academy at Shrivenham, I was teaching officers who have seen war, who've been in war, officers generally of major, level major and above. And part of their training was to learn also about political and other forms of and tools of deterrence that could be used. The point here, and we are not arguing here against the notion of deterrence, that's from time immemorial been part of defence policies, and indeed part of our individual policies, certainly mine as a woman at walking home at night, you know, so when I was a lot younger usually, they don't bother with me now, but you know, in all kinds of ways. And what you're basically signalling is, don't mess with me, because you aren't going to like what you get. And I didn't have to carry a weapon to do that, but I did have to change and, you know, think about how I came across. That kind of deterrence is the kind of deterrence we need to recognize is multidimensional. Those army majors, they know it because they are trying to use it and they're trying to make it work. The problem with nuclear weapons, well, the problem with deterrence is it does fail sometimes. It always fails sometimes. And this is how you get conflicts ending up into wars. The problem with nuclear weapons, and particularly the ideological, faith-based reliance on nuclear weapons as the deterrent. In fact, you're not even allowed to say that Britain has nuclear weapons. We're only allowed to talk about the nuclear deterrent. But you know, that makes it difficult to ask the question, does the deterrent deter? You logicians know how. So, you know, if you name a cat dog, or even if you genuinely believe that your cat is a dog, it doesn't actually confer the ability on the cat to bark. And this is part of what we are dealing with. So here we are thinking about for whom, because this motion does not say, it says nuclear weapons have made the world safer. It doesn't say nuclear weapons have made certain nuclear weapon states' leaders feel safer. And it certainly, if you look right back to the beginning of the first explosions, and some of you will have seen Oppenheimer, and then the follow-up explosions known as nuclear, well, then there was the follow-up explosions of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 2 major cities, and then lots of nuclear testing, 2,000 nuclear tests, all of which were exploding nuclear weapons above ground, underwater, in near space and underground. 2,000, often, usually, in fact, on the territories of indigenous people. In the Pacific, in Australia, Kazakhstan was where the Soviets, or they went up to the Arctic and the Nenets, the lands of the Nenets, Lop Nor, the lands of the Uyghur people. You look at any nuclear weapon state, you know, the first French tests, Algeria, UK used the US nuclear test site in Nevada for 23 of its nuclear tests. And indeed, the people, the Western Shoshone people of Nueva Zigobia, as they called it, just like the Pacific, had names. You know, Mororoa, Fangataufa, those are names that had meaning for the Tahitian Polynesians. All of these people living in those places were not made safer by nuclear weapons at all. The people living along the route, I heard someone talk about, were you talking about Capenhurst? Yes. And we know that there are leukemia clusters around bases like Aldermaston, Burfield, Capenhurst. There were around, I think they're still, Dounreay. There certainly were in the 80s when radioactive discharges from Aldermaston went into the Thames. Low level, admittedly, but in storms they came up, underneath after Navet's primary school, and then they came up in quantities that were not safe. The nuclear warhead convoys that regularly still travel between the Berkshire bomb factories of Burfield and Aldermaston and the naval nuclear bases and bomb stores in Scotland that doesn't actually want those, of Faslane and Coulport, not safer. Those convoys, they've slipped off icy roads. The factories and the convoys have been involved in near misses with things like fires and crashes and all kinds of things. Not safer. So let's just accept nuclear weapons have not made the world safer. Not everybody in the world. They also, and this is important, why do you think 93 countries in the world, in only 3 years since the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was negotiated, a multilateral treaty negotiated in the UN General Assembly and adopted by 122 nations of the UN General Assembly, 93 of those in the first 3 years have signed, and 70 exactly now, we've just had an additional signature, are states parties. Now, this is the treaty of the future, and I want us, in recognizing that nuclear weapons have not made us safe, also recognize that there are ways in which we can greatly reduce the dangers of nuclear weapons. Not necessarily down to zero, not perhaps in my lifetime, but we can. And that is through treaty making. And, this was what I was also teaching in Shrivenham, was not just the nuclear treaties, but biological and chemical treaties, but this is the UN treaty. And we, Florian and I and Wood, were at meetings at the UN of the second meeting of states parties. Now, what was so interesting about that was it was very practically focused on what we have to do to get the nuclear armed states, of which there are only 9, and 12,000 of their nuclear weapons are involved in both the Middle East and particularly around the Ukraine war. We are relying on dumb luck, as Dean Acheson, who was Eisenhower's or Truman's Secretary of State, said after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Chatham House has done a study in 2014, 10 years ago, a study, and said there were 13 very, very near misses. The Petrov incident was one of them. Able Archer, a nuclear exercise on the borders of Germany in 1983, just about a month after the Petrov incident. These were very near misses. We didn't necessarily know about them at the time, but we've got the documents to know about them now. So what the treaty is trying to do, it doesn't just prohibit the production, possession, testing, deployment of nuclear weapons, but it also deals with and is really building up now what you have to do to be able to verifiably eliminate the nuclear arsenals. Yeah.
The treaty sounds like an excellent idea, but I suppose the worry is that, say, North Korea, who won't get rid of their nuclear weapons, will, if they're the only country that have them, just be able to push everyone else in the world around to do what they want. Russia the same, China the same. Do you think that's a serious concern?
Thank you for that point. I've just had the please conclude, or 1 minute or something. So I'm actually going to just jump here that what we have to recognize is we actually can put the nuclear genie back into the bottle. That doesn't mean we can disinvent it. It means we control it. It means that we set up the systems for the safe, secure dismantling of nuclear weapons. And we know how, because actually Britain has done a lot of unilateral nuclear disarmament at the end of the Cold War. We worked towards the INF Treaty, and all of those land-based nuclear weapons, the cruise missiles, the Pershing II, the SS-20s on the Soviet side, got dismantled and disposed of. We have that, and Aldermaston doesn't need to keep making nuclear weapons. It needs to be contributing its skills, which are very considerable on this issue, towards the verification of the controlled elimination of all nuclear weapons. That means the controlling, the reductions, and then the elimination. This is a role where Britain can play a role in as a former, or as a reducing nuclear armed state towards going beyond the nuclear dangers and helping the world to become a safer place. We have a lot of work to do for this. The treaties can help us. They don't solve all the problems of human nature and war, because we have to do that. And we have to do that with all the instruments and tools at our disposal, but not with nuclear weapons. So, believing something, however ardently, does not make it true. To live in the real world, it makes sense to oppose this motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, for that insightful speech. And thank you once again to all our speakers, but also to briefly thank as well is both Ivan and Gabriel, who worked with Sami, our debates officer, very hard to invite all these eminent guests and what a fantastic debate it was. So could we please give our speakers and Gabriel and Ivan a round of applause? Now, after a sort of slightly sobering debate, I'll join you all at the bar, but please remember to get involved, that there's at the back of every order paper all the rules for the debate each week, and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you so much.